Hele wama no stoa le kone. No stoa to avere wama ku ko man. Mo honti wama kini akolo ko. Wama no stoa ko. Nabo wama kele ku wama ku hole to te ha. Ya mu buhio ma ya ko tare. Wama ku nasiha.
Antropólogo llama papui mi heite, wama ku ko taomi, wama ke estudiano mo te taomi heja. Ya tema wai krayoma, wama ku mai, shori mi ham greko, kami llama ko tamo o te mi kam kulipa.
The more you accomplish, the more jealousy you inspire. The more jealousy you inspire, the more vigorously you are attacked by your jealous competitors who've been outdone. And this tends to be stronger in a discipline like anthropology whereas there's absolutely no agreement about anything. They not only don't have standards of proof, they don't even want to agree on whether there's a real world or not. So given the lack of any real standards for settling issues, the attacks become more vigorous. And I think Napoleon Chagnon has the distinction of being the only anthropologist that's ever been accused of genocide.
Les Indiens qu'on appelle communément Waika se nomment dans leur langue Yanomami. La densité de la forêt, l'humidité, les serpents, les moustiques les ont tenus à l'abri de tout contact avec ce qu'il est convenu d'appeler la civilisation. Leur société obéit à des règles qui lui sont propres. Leur culture est parfaitement vierge de toute influence extérieure. Les étudier, les connaître, c'est nous connaître nous-mêmes si nous savons nous garder de tout esprit de supériorité. Les seuls matériaux dont ils disposent leur sont fournis par la forêt. Le bois, les lianes, les feuilles, les os et les dents des animaux et des poissons. Toute leur technologie en découle. Pas de classe sociale, pas de chef, pas de dieu, pas d'argent.
The Yanomami are relatively unique in the modern world because they are one of the few tribes remaining that lived in the kinds of conditions that our ancestors lived in, without a nation state to constrain and interdict their political behavior.
What we are seeing in the Yanomami is something approaching humanity as it existed for 500,000 years. What we see in New York or Brasilia or Paris is the way humanity has existed only for at most 3,000 or 4,000 years. So from a purely scientific sense, they are extremely valuable as a source of knowledge. We should learn everything we can about them, what they know, how they feel, what their motivations are.
Certainly there are a lot of other anthropologists who've contributed to the awareness of the Yanomami in the world, but it still is a fact that probably 3 or 4 million American students alone have read my book on the Yanomami. And they became famous largely through my publications and through the films that I made with Timothy Ash.
When I first went to live with the Yanomami, they wanted to know my name. I told them that it was Chagnon, or Chagnon, but they couldn't pronounce it. It sounded to them like their name for a pesky bee, Shanki, and that is what they decided to call me. To the Yanomami, I am the man called Bee.
By then, a lot of survival groups, conservation groups, were beginning to learn more about the Yanomami, and they all wanted to have the Yanomami in their portfolio because everybody is looking for the most desirable product to sell. Even among rock stars like Sting, they all want a part of the action and be associated with the Yanomami now that they have become famous.
Unlike our civilization, which uses natural resources with little or no thought for the future, the Yanomami are perfectly adapted to the place in which they live. Undisturbed, their way of life could survive for another 20,000 years and more.
So the Yanomami became misrepresented by these survival groups as being the most innocent, flawless, altruistic, noble savages in the world. And in a sense, I think that that's kind of racist. They seem to assume that no people are worthy of our support and our sympathy unless these people are pure as the wind-blown snow. Most of the books written about tribal peoples in anthropology would emphasize, sometimes even in the title of the book, how peaceful, lovable, gentle, noble, innocent these people were. When it became clear the very first day that the Yanomami were still engaged in tribal warfare, that was astonishing to me. And after about a year, I was able to demonstrate that about 1/3 of all the adult males died violently. I also then discovered that approximately 40% of all men aged 25 and older participated in the killing of at least one other person. So when 40% of the population has committed a homicide, you're not talking about a peaceful tribe.
Intoxicated on drugs, they are compelled by the headmen to fight with each other. This will allow them to discharge their frustration at the death of a dear kinsman. They will leave on a raid to kill their enemies the following day.
When I published my first book, shortly after I completed my first year of field research, I subtitled it The Fierce People. The title was Yanomami, The Fierce People. So because the Yanomami themselves regarded themselves as fierce and valiant, I used that as the subtitle, at least during the first 3 editions of my book, which has now gone through 5 editions.
I read Chagnon's book in the 60s, a child of the 60s, if you will, in which I thought, wow, isn't this exciting? Look at the way he outwitted them. It was like Indiana Jones of today. And I thought, wow, this will really excite them. In those days, we had to do films rather than all this newer technology. And so I was rewinding the film after it was over, and a student came up to me. I said, wasn't that a fantastic movie? And he said, no. And I said, what was wrong with it? He said, you taught us to really appreciate others in their own context and appreciate them. These people came out looking like disgusting savages.
Dedehe were offered to kill by sorcery any enemy Lelebawa chose to specify. Lelebawa asked him to send Hekura to destroy the souls of children in the distant village of Mahikodoteri.
I thought about it. I acknowledged it was the one with the green slime coming down their noses, and I never used it again.
My initial publications avoided the question of what they were fighting about, but I did imply that most arguments and conflicts began in arguments over women, infidelity, and sex.
You don't have to be an anthropologist to discover something so obvious. You just have to know the language. Why? Because you kill the firstborn girl because you want a male in your family. And if they kill the firstborn child being a woman, or you give them a bad treatment and she dies, then you have more male and less female.
Bueno, guerra siempre se comienza por la mujer. O sea que mujer, esta comunidad puede ir en otra comunidad, el muchacho. Ese muchacho trae mujer. Entonces, como otra comunidad no le gusta que esté mujer aquí, entonces viene a atacar. Si esta comunidad no quiere entregarse, entonces ahí fue que forma la guerra.
They began suggesting that I had missed something, that there's some strategic resource that the Yanomami are fighting about. And they eventually settled on red protein, high-quality game. And so Professor Harris challenged me by saying, if you can show that they get the equivalent of 1 Big Mac per day, I'll eat my hat.
Wadoshewa and his agnates spend most of the night tending the meat, some of which is roasted on racks, and some of which is boiled in cooking pots. Wadoshewa begins working on the meat, cutting the larger portions into smaller pieces for distribution.
They not only ate the equivalent of 1 Big Mac, but quite a bit more than that as well. So this was empirical data that showed that they were not having a shortage, or that they were not suffering from a shortage of protein in their diet.
But the interesting part is suddenly Hames had all this protein data. He had done a protein study, apparently.
There were a large group of us, Ken Good, Eric Fredlin, 2 other graduate students from Penn State, and a bunch of other senior anthropologists, such as Napoleon Chagnon, who was heading up the project. Jacques Lizot was also part of this group. And they were going to essentially take us up by river and drop us off place by place to the villages that we were going to study. And it turned out I was the first one to be dropped off. Basically, Chagnon introduced me to the people that first day, said I was a good guy, was associated with him so they could trust me, and that I described the nature of the kind of research that I wanted to do, asked their permission to allow me to do this research, gave them an idea that if cooperation was good, then various trade goods would come their way, and to treat me well, and they did.
And they published an article together in Science magazine based on that work at that village. This village was so acculturated, it had a store. I went in there myself and bought sugar and salt and cans of meat. It was unbelievable. And they didn't mention that they had a name for the village. And it wasn't a village. Some straggler Yanomami. Some of them were married to Yakwana people. They were living there. They could go fishing with them in their canoes. They did the, and this was being represented in Science magazine to the world as a refutation of Harris and a demonstration that there wasn't a shortage of protein, and that certainly was not related to warfare.
We talk about the village of Toropoteri, which is the Yanomami name of the houses where the 2 Yanomami houses are, one at the edge and one about a half hour away. I don't think we mentioned anything about the Yakwana, and again, because it wasn't pertinent to the kind of argument that we were making. But that information was readily available, became more readily available with original publications before that are about the same time, and later on. And so I don't think there's, anything that was more to say about that.
Lizot and I couldn't be more diametrically opposed theoretically. He was a student of Levi-Strauss, and I of Marvin Harris. But yet we came together and we felt this was an outrage, because he knew the village too, Lizot, of course he did. He was closer to than I was. And we wrote a letter to Science, and they wouldn't publish it. And we don't know what was behind all of that. Harris tried to get it published, but my point here is that data was phony.
Apparently, when you start measuring things and making scientific predictions on the basis of hypotheses and testing hypotheses, anthropologists get really angry about doing that, because it means that somebody can be shown to be wrong.
Data is crucial. Now, the problem in cultural anthropologists, first of all, most cultural anthropologists work alone. More people you take into the remote areas, too disruptive. You won't be seeing traditional natural behavior.
I have spent many delightful hours with Dede Hewa, one of the most knowledgeable men I have known, and a true leader. He has told me about the details of village history, of ancient and current wars with other villages, and secrets of kinship and genealogy that bind the members of his village together. As he periodically reminded me, he possesses the truth.
Let us have data that others can check. Others can go back and look. Not just say, I've checked it, I've done it, and look in the mirror and say, am I honest? Yes, I'm honest. Believe me.
People who know the Yanomami and the data and so forth far better than I, like Bruce Albert and Jacques Lizot and Brian Ferguson, have published statements in the anthropological literature calling into question some of Chagnon's data and interpretations and so forth. So even what looks like hard data, statistics, etc., can be questioned, can be manipulated, can be interpreted in different ways, and so forth.
That, to me, was really, I think, one of the highest examples of unethical publishing that I've seen in Yanomami work, because I know it personally. The others, they tell some other people, but I can't judge it. This I know for a fact.
I have a cynical attitude about Mr. Good, because he's spent a large fraction of his career criticizing me and denouncing me and trying to describe me as an ogre and unfair and unreasonable and depriving him of opportunities, etc., etc. So it's very difficult for me to look at Mr. Good in a rational academic way.
Our first night in the jungle, Chagnon was drinking rum with somebody, or scotch somebody brought in. He was drunk as hell, and so was another guy. And they decided they were going to initiate these guys after we had already had our heads, filled with the fierce people. How dangerous it was. And I said, well, I have my shotgun. He said, oh, no. He says, they'll creep under your hammock at night and take your shotgun. I said, okay, then I'm not going down there unless you give me a handgun. I'm going to sleep with it on my chest. Well, we can't get a handgun through customs. I said, well, I don't know. This is how I was affected by all this. Imagine how I felt after the first year there, and I realized how absurd this was. That this, my field director had actually equipped us with chemical mace to spray the Yanomami in case they were aggressive. A field worker is supposed to go out and establish rapport with his people he's living with, not mace them.
Now, he married early in his career a Yanomama woman from the village of Hasubuateri, where the village I first took him to. But if you look at the photograph of her and the photograph I took of her 2 years earlier in an earlier census, and you look at her and try to estimate her age, she could not have been more than about 11 years old at the time. And yet, appealing to different customs and different cultures and repudiating Western notions about love and legal age at marriage, etc., etc., he blew this into a heart-wrenching, romantic love story about falling in love with the Indian princess and having a family by her. Another word for what he did would be pedophilia.
What do you expect Chagnon and his people to say? Find anything good about this relation? No, they're going to try to twist it and turn it. It's bad, it's wrong, he crossed the line, he did this, he did that, and so on. Get into the age thing, which is basically all it is ethnocentrism. Believe it or not, anthropologists are ethnocentric, and even racist.
When Ken Good married her, she was not younger than the age at which Yanomami women marry other, their own men. So I think by Yanomami standards, it was not an unethical thing. Fact remains that Ken Good is not a Yanomami, and by our standards, by the standards of his own society, he was marrying a girl who was not of age to make a decision for herself, and that sort of thing.
Hay Yanomami que quieren nape, ¿no? Porque Yanomami cree que el nape lo ayude mucho, ¿no? Por ejemplo, un cacique le dice, mira, este niñita se puede dar con un nape. Para que nos vivamos con él y que traiga las cosas. Así vivimos mejor. Para que venga, para que llame a los médicos por aquí, que vivan con nosotros. Entonces Yanomami piensa así, ¿no?
Should somebody have a love affair with somebody in the field? No. Would I do it? Hasn't happened yet. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm 66. I don't expect this to happen, you know. No sweet young thing like Urema is going to come and have an affair with me, okay? However, having done it, I think that Kenneth is to be admired for admitting it and for talking about as he does.
Where do you draw the line which you shouldn't cross? And given the fact that I have lived with him so long, that line, if there was one, seems to fade away. There is no line.
He not only divorced his first wife, his second girlfriend committed suicide. His third wife, at least the ones that I know about, was this Yanomami woman that he calls Urema. And that's not her real name. I don't know if he even knows her real name.
Here you have a guy painting this as the most brutal, fighting, fierce people, and then you have an American anthropologist, an ex-student, marrying one of them. That doesn't fit the image. It doesn't do well. So obviously, he's against that. Not every anthropologist can be expected to stay 12 years down there among the group. They have lives. They want to live their culture. But nevertheless, you cannot discard the fact that when you get to know a people well, that the similarities far outweigh the differences. But at first contact, you see it just the opposite. Well, Chagnon says it, and I don't know if I felt it, that when he first went there, he thought, about turning around and getting out. There's no way he's going to could stay among these people. Of course, what happened to me ultimately was I didn't want to leave. I came here out of default. I didn't want to leave the Yanomami. I wanted to stay there.
Oh, jeez. Pots and pans.
That I took so many.
Em 86, eles desembarcaram no aeroporto de Kennedy, aqui em Nova York. Arima nunca tinha pisado num chão que não fosse de terra batida. Nunca tinha visto um carro, um prédio, um poste de luz, um telefone. Ela, que veio de uma tribo de 200 pessoas, perguntou ao marido, a sua tribo é maior que a minha?
But look, my book was out in 9 languages. It's been sold very well in a number of countries. 3 Hollywood screenplays have been written on it. National Geographic did a documentary. Okay, I was in People magazine 3 times. Let's not chalk that up as academic credits.
I look at it as if he had brought some wild animal back to the United States with a ring through her nose or through her ear and was just parading her and exploiting her for commercial purposes.
He really hates Kenneth Good. I mean, you almost get the sense that he's going to foam at the mouth, you know, when he talks about Kenneth. He really hates him with a passion. So that's Ken Good. He used to serve the people of the National Geographic, entering Mavaca. If I'm not mistaken, Jarima leaves Ken actually on this trip at the end. So this is the trip where they break up. This is Jarima. So Ken Good is in Mavaca, and at the other end of Mavaca is Chagnon, you know, the enemies. And of course, they don't want to see each other, you know.
Yarima thought she was coming down to another rainforest, my forest. But again, the wonders of the flexibility of the human mind, she adapted here very, very well. And she had no problem with our material existence. She had problem with that aspect that attracted me down there. And that was that feeling of interpersonal relationship, that community. And said, she used to say, they live in a box. They live inside, all enclosed, and they look at television. When she wakes up, she sees a whole village, all the people, the leaders, the shamans, the relatives, the loved ones, and the nieces and nephews, and it's all there. And there's her life right before her. We wake up. She thought it was the saddest, most depressing thing that a man and his wife would go take their children and live enclosed all alone. It's not the way. That's why she said when she left, that's not the way humans are meant to live, not one more day. And I understood her. But I kind of got, you know, caught up in things here with the kids and the job and all that.
And I suppose the next book from Kenneth Good will be How My Heart Was Broken Because I Had to Get Divorced.
It seems like the people who study Yanomami get a little strange. I don't know. But having said that, there's no question that a couple of the individuals involved here are rather unique. And of course, the extreme of all of that is Chagnon.
Anthropology from the very beginning has had a hostile attitude toward any theory of biology that might purport to explain culture or cultural behavior. So the view of people in anthropology is that A, they have no significant biological dimensions, and that B, they're pretty much nice critters. However, as anthropology became more and more scientific, it became clear that this battle was not going to be easily won.
The social behavior of organisms of any sort is shaped by evolution, by natural selection, in order to reproduce the genes of the organisms involved. The idea would be that in any population of animals, natural selection will favor behaviors that cause the individual to get their genes into future generations. What Chagnon and I did, and some others at about that time in the mid-70s, is say this works for other organisms, ought to work for people. People are animals too. Let's look at human behavior and see if it doesn't work.
I then began investigating the possible correlation between reproductive success and warfare. It immediately popped out of my data that killers had more success at acquiring mates, at acquiring wives. They had approximately 2.5 times more wives than men who had not killed. And then when I began looking at the number of children that these men respectively had, an astonishing conclusion came right out of the data, that not only do they have more wives, but they have about 3 times more children.
Fits right in beautifully with the theory that you see even in other species. So here you have the Yanomami who, why are they fighting? Well, they're fighting because it's in their blood, so to speak. It's in their genes. They're trying to do what they have no choice in doing.
They strike silently, usually at dawn, and kill. They also fear retaliation, and they know the capacity of all groups to fight back.
If you take the Yanomami, if you take the chimpanzee material, if you take what some people say about archaeology, you get this picture. Chimpanzees represent our common ancestors in the past. They act like our ancestors did 6 million years ago. They have this inborn tendency to kill members of other groups when they can. The Yanomami are taken to represent our ancestors back at the dawn of agriculture, and they're killing each other not because there's any kind of scarcities of material goods, but because they have this competition for reproductive success. And so males are always striving in different ways to maximize their reproductive success, and that leads them to engage in war.
And this isn't just fooling around games. I mean, you're offering a representation of human behavior, which is going to have so many other ramifications. That's why you're doing these studies to begin with.
If Chagnon can show a correlation between something really ugly like warfare and violence and something biologically useful like reproductive success, that opens Pandora's box, and the next thing you know, we're going to have the Holocaust all over again.
If we have this inside us, if we have the idea that there's somebody from a different group, and no matter how much you qualify it and saying, well, culture is different, there's still inside us this impulse to kill them, and that's what's claimed, then I think we're in real trouble. And I think that we need to, if we're going to work against war, I think we need to work against the idea that war is human nature.
Ferguson's theory is to blame us for the Yanomami warfare, while Chagnon is saying that blame the Yanomami, if you will. This is something that is inherent in their culture.
Napoleón lo traía regalo, lo que traía regalo. Ah, Jackie, bueno, con nosotros, va a estar por aquí, a visitarnos como cuántos días, a venir otra vez. Entonces venga a veces, venga, porque nosotros necesitamos lo que necesitamos, ¿no? Machete.
I've watched Yanomami use stone axes to chop down trees. It's very, very difficult, and you can appreciate the value of a steel axe or a machete.
It takes about 10 times as much effort to cut down a tree with a stone axe as a steel axe. And you multiply that by everything you have to chop, that's an awful lot. Steel axes and machetes, a Marxist could say, become necessary means of production.
My possessions are more important to the Mishimishimabui Teddy than my services, and we always exchange items. I do not really want the bows, arrows, spun cotton, and other things they offer me, but I cannot do my work without providing them with fishhooks, fish line, machetes, and knives. They would not accept me for very long unless I brought them these things.
What I'm arguing is that force is used to get better access to Western manufactured goods. And one of the reasons why it's so valued is, Western goods are so valued, is that better access to Western goods means people get more wives.
Brian's argument was very similar to the theoretical assumption or background behind this delightful film about the Bushmen in South Africa in the Kalahari Desert, The Gods Must Be Crazy. And the movie opens up with a rough, scruffy bush pilot flying over the Kalahari Desert drinking a Coca-Cola. And as wanton Europeans are, careless, disrespectful to the environment, he opens the airplane window and tosses the Coke bottle out over the Kalahari. The Coke bottle lands right in the middle of a community of Bushmen.
One day, something fell from the sky. He had never seen anything like this in his life.
And they had never seen this Coke bottle before. And they find it very useful, but there's only one of them.
But the gods had been careless. They had sent only one. And now, for the first time in their lives, here was a thing which could not be shared because there was only one of it. Suddenly everybody needed it most of the time. A thing they had never needed before became a necessity. And unfamiliar emotions began to stir, and other new things came. Anger, jealousy, hate, and violence.
And so they start fighting over the Coke bottle. And suddenly they become quite violent. People are getting bopped on the head by the Coke bottle, and suddenly they realize that this Coke bottle has caused great grief among our society. The gods must be crazy for sending it to us. Well, Brian Ferguson's argument is basically not Coke bottles. They're not fighting over Coke bottles, but they're fighting over steel tools. And that everything I say about women and revenge is beside the point. They're fighting over access to secret trade routes. And his book is very, very well documented in terms of the history of colonization of the Amazon basin and things like that, but his command and grasp of the Yanomami reality is pitiful.
Well, when Napoleon reviewed my book, An American Anthropologist, he never engaged with my argument at all. I don't think a Coke bottle or a machete or anything like that would have that kind of effect, but I think there is a kind of a figurative truth to that movie. I think the reason somebody would make a movie like that is that they probably know, among people like the Kung, that introduction of these outside goods is disruptive.
To the first part of that accusation of me interfering in the culture of the Yanomami, I plead guilty. Every anthropologist who goes and lives with people like the Yanomami interferes to some extent with the people that they're studying. And if I'm guilty, the entirety of anthropology as a science is also guilty, and every anthropologist in the world is guilty of the same crime and misdemeanor I committed.
Les Yanomami protégés par la forêt sont restés à l'écart de ces bouleversements, mais pour combien de temps? Depuis 1950, les missionnaires se sont installés sur les rives de l'Orinoque. Des expéditions scientifiques ou médicales commencent à pénétrer le long du fleuve, mais la plupart des groupes Yanomami n'ont encore jamais vu un homme blanc. On peut encore étudier leur culture et peut-être empêcher que sa rencontre inéluctable avec la culture occidentale soit aussi destructrice qu'elle le fut pour d'autres. Dans cette région du Venezuela, la carte est encore vierge. C'est là que nous avons rencontré Jacques Lizot, ethnologue français, au terme d'un séjour de 2 ans chez les Yanomami.
The warfare, the intellectual warfare between the Marxists and the sociobiologists, between left and right, manifests as a very intense competition to gather data and to claim the Yanomami as a pristine tribal group for completely opposing perspectives on human culture and evolution. And Levi-Strauss really can't allow Chagnon to get an exclusive monopoly of this, the largest intact remote tribal group in the world.
C'est un pays extrêmement dur, et c'est d'ailleurs pour cette raison qu'il est resté coupé du monde jusqu'à 15 ou 20 ans, puisqu'il s'agit d'une population très récemment découverte, la plus importante d'ailleurs de celles qui subsistent encore dans toute l'Amérique du Sud, et qui vraisemblablement n'est parvenue à subsister qu'à cause de cette extraordinaire dureté, non seulement vis-à-vis de l'étranger, de l'ethnologue qui venait pour la première fois leur rendre visite, mais vis-à-vis d'eux-mêmes.
D'abord, il y a la condition première qu'un ethnologue doit vivre dans l'habitation même de la population qu'il étudie. Je veux dire, dans le cadre même et dans la résidence même de la population qu'il étudie. Ça, c'est la condition première. Et cette condition, ça suppose qu'il soit accepté et il soit respecté par les gens avec lesquels il vit.
As I understand it, Lizot was a linguist and he was a Middle Eastern scholar. He was not in any way connected with Yanomami linguistics or South America. And it was Levi-Strauss himself who specifically intervened to get him to switch to study the Yanomami and to accompany the 1968 expedition. So Levi-Strauss already has, in my view, enormous responsibility for everything that happens with Lizot.
Pensez-vous de cela? Cette façon nécessaire de troubler le milieu?
C'est inévitable. C'est inévitable et je pense que c'est une façon de le troubler qui est tout de même vénielle en comparaison des bouleversements et des destructions que l'expansion de la colonisation intérieure, celui de la civilisation industrielle, la construction de routes, le passage d'avions causent. Et l'ethnologue ne peut pas se sentir coupable de contribuer pour si peu à un mouvement que s'il le pouvait, certainement, il souhaiterait suspendre ou en tout cas modérer.
He was sent there by Claude Levi-Strauss to study myths, which is what Levi-Strauss does, or did. In the end, got working on language, and actually started working with developing local schools in the villages and writing a dictionary.
Petit vocabulaire Yanomami. Mon enfant.
Eheluya.
Donne-moi cet enfant.
Eheluya adahio.
Un jeune.
Fia.
Le hamac.
Ninkake.
Au début, moi je suis plutôt pudibonde. Je suis un peu, bon, ça c'est mon cas, mais j'avoue que j'étais extrêmement étonnée par les traductions qu'il y a dans le texte de Lizot concernant un certain nombre de concepts, comme frotter. Alors frotter, beaucoup de mots, c'était frotter le pénis. Alors frotter le sexe. Et alors, au début, je me disais, mais quelle connaissance il a des Yanomami pour arriver à capter ces mots-là. Parce que moi qui avais travaillé chez les Panarés, pour obtenir déjà le terme masturbation, pour moi j'arrivais pas à expliquer. Je veux dire, j'étais extrêmement timide dans ma recherche de certains mots que le dictionnaire a. Bon, la sexualité, ça fait partie de la vie, donc il faut qu'elle soit dans le dictionnaire aussi. Eh bien, bon, je me suis dit, puisqu'ils sont dans le dictionnaire de Lizot, je vais les vérifier. Eh bien, c'est là où on s'aperçoit tout de suite que sa vision de la sexualité interfère très lourdement et très erronément sur le sens des mots. C'est que frotter, c'était pas seulement frotter le pénis. C'était frotter deux mains, les mains, frotter la tête, frotter. C'était frotter en général.
Entre las fotografías que tengo de esos viajes, hay una muy curiosa, que es que los Yanomami, en uno de los pueblos, hacían pequeñas figuras de cera, en las cuales mostraban, la figura de cera mostraba cierta prolongación. Y me llamó la atención. Y les pregunté por qué hacían eso. Entonces me decían Lizot. Llamaban al muñequito que habían puesto con esa prolongación, lo llamaban Lizot.
No, ¿sabe cómo son otros naperos? Pero yo tengo pena de decir. Lizot, los jóvenes de allá de arriba, a Lizot le hacía monochipliku kamaje. Tenía muy majene, ya hubra majene que hay. Lizot, el Yanomami le hacía así, ¿no? Los jóvenes trabajaban así. Y el líquido se botaba.
They have a funny, strange term for anal sex, bosi nawai. Well, to have sex, heterosexual, copulation, is called nawai, which literally means, na is short for naka, which means vagina, and wai means to eat. So to eat vagina is what they call normal heterosexual intercourse, nawai. To have anal intercourse, they didn't know how to explain it. And bosi means anus. So they called that bosi nawai. Now you figure that out. Bosi means anus, na means vagina, and wai means to eat.
Después a los mayores. A los mayores. Por ejemplo, 20 años, 50 años, ¿no?
For the French, Claude Levi-Strauss is an indispensable cultural icon. I mean, in the Logos Project summary of the 90 most influential books of the last 100 years, 2 of the books are by Levi-Strauss. So he is one of the giants of the last century. And the idea that he could have sent a major intellectual disciple who is a pedophile into the jungle and supported him for decades is just incomprehensible. It doesn't compute with their whole identity as French intellectuals.
Ce que je voulais dire, qui est très dramatique, c'est de savoir que Lizot aura à sa suite des gens qui, eux, perturberont complètement cette société.
Hai o te teha plato pemhaja ruman ko peta pohona no hipa wei ya puya kun mi tha pe ya ki sia ton ya ka yo haruma plato ya pemhaja ruma plato pemraja ru ah kun te hawong apoma pe wani im kiniana thai wei ya tag mai ha ya im kmos pralioma ya im ka mos pralun interior ka korokratitia ka uka pralema hei tapa ko otamon shori akuma mi otere kuno mi peimono si para hupamon si tobra par hokupari kami ha nta wale ha mai pralene tak para koare itakui mi ena awani kuwa maya ihiru te peheri ya nyamuano preoma lisona ihiru per imukre shami thama noi wedinak evai kuma wedika mumol kulena anama ema or kulena devia or kulena kue en ha pashino thapoma 10 años 11 años para abajo liso wedi pe ko watja hio pamato hi pehete heiwari imukre shami na thare wedi pe ko watja hio pa gravador pata mania para hio show ya kuma apu hito para Roma monk para palma aja ha Samuel apehete thakataran thak uswane ma ya pu maku wai kyota hei monier hupa wai klema ya pu makuta me ha escopeta poma paneta he ai ena poma pane com ko a venha rua hoja kuma hopa maknia huja kuma makue kamane pe wale poskana jai wa otama motora ne hipana 25 motora un hano wajema Jacques Lizot hizo mucha sexual entre los muchachos. Ya todos, casi 9 comunidades que está acá, saben todo eso. No ellos solos.
Eso es verdad, todo el mundo sabe, aquí no se puede decir que no. Todos nosotros sabemos. Ocamo, Mavaca, Platanal, Cheroana, Arimave, Caroji, todos sabemos. Yo también yo sé, aunque yo soy mayor.
You know, anthropologists are humans, and sometimes humans do horrible things that are very, very shameful, very embarrassing, very shocking.
I was annoyed at some point because they were lumping me in with this sexual behavior with Yanomami, like there was Lizot with the little boys and there was Ken Good with the little girls.
¿Cómo es posible que le hayan permitido la venida acá? Hay varios libros ya escritos que denuncian esa actitud de Lizot.
There were major disincentives to take on Lizot because he had the full backing of Yvick, he had the full backing of the French embassy, he had the full backing of L'École des Hautes Études at the University of Paris. So he had a lot of power, he had a lot of money, and he had Claude Levi-Strauss's support. So what are you going to do? You're going to take on a major disciple of the world's most famous cultural anthropologist? If you're just a missionary who's getting by on, $100 a month, or you're a Yanomami, how can you possibly take him on? Chagnon, however, went further than simply being a passive witness to Lizot's sexual predations. He actually signed a letter supporting Lizot's continued presence in Yanomami territory when the Silesians did try to expel him in the mid-70s. So I think that Chagnon has a very special responsibility for Lizot's continued sexual atrocities in Yanomami lands.
I think you have to ask Chagnon, why didn't he report it to the Venezuelan government? You have to ask that to others who were in that particular area. You have to ask that of the Salesians, who were there on a daily basis for years and years. If they actually knew that was going on, what did they do about it?
Durante muchos años, Lizot, por ejemplo, algunas bases antropológicas, Lizot nos ayudó a los misioneros a entender. Él venía y nos daba clases de antropología a todos los misioneros, clases de lingüística, luchó por la salud, luchó por la educación. Pienso que Lizot no explotó a los Yanomami, sino que él más bien colaboró con nosotros también en la parte educativa. Entonces, la vida personal de cada quien, allá él, ¿verdad?
Aunque los salesianos veían, y lo saben muy bien, y no lo hicieron denuncia.
Personne n'a jamais rien fait, ni académique, ni au niveau de la diplomatie ici, ni le ministère de l'Éducation. Lizot était le seul personnage qui avait un visa ad vitam aeternam chez les Yanomami. Il entrait et sortait comme il voulait. Il rentrait, sortait, il allait directement de la Carlotte à l'aéroport de Caracas, recto, à Platanal. Personne ne contrôlait. Alors, et ça a été dit, comme je vous le dis, dans les journaux, officiellement, par un gouverneur d'État. Donc, quel est le secret? Il n'y avait aucun secret là-dessous.
Lizot found the perfect place, you know. In a sense, no man's land. There was no government presence. The missions did very little supervision of the villages, and Lizot always chose a village that was not too close, you know, a little bit far away. In a sense, he created his own territory.
Et alors je paie très cher les Yanomami pour qu'ils acceptent de dire les noms des gens, de leurs parents, et les noms des morts, qui sont encore plus interdits que les autres. Alors, moi-même et l'ethnologue Chagnon qui m'a précédé, avons introduit ce changement, c'est que maintenant, dans les groupes où nous avons vécu le plus longtemps, les Yanomami acceptent qu'on prononce leur nom, et même entre eux, prononcent leur nom. C'est un changement que nous-mêmes avons apporté. C'est un exemple. On pourra en trouver d'autres.
Yeah, he introduced prostitution. There is no... I'm not sure he introduced it per se. I mean, I know that other people had sex with the Yanomami women in exchange for food, but he made it systematic. He made it a way of life in certain villages.
Of course, Lizot himself creates a whole ethnography around sexuality, which becomes almost as popular in the French sphere of culture as Chagnon's image of ferocity does in the American sphere of culture. And according to Lizot, the Yanomami are these extraordinarily adept sexual practitioners who have all kinds of improvisations and masturbatory practices, and homosexuality is accepted in common, child sex, and so on and so forth is all normal part of their culture according to Lizot.
It's a power relationship. So, Lizot's gay, he likes kids. Well, he has a lot of things to trade, you know? Lots of things. I mean, lots of things he had. Lizot would travel in 2 airplanes. One was just full of goods. I mean, hammocks, not like 3 or 4 hammocks, it was just dozens of hammocks. Food, I mean, incredible amounts of stuff. And of course, what did he have? A little town of boys.
Psychologiquement, il est judicieux de montrer les cadeaux sous prétexte de préparer la distribution. Les Indiens n'en seront que plus motivés pour les tâches que nous avons à leur demander.
I believe that the Collège de France or the University of Michigan or the University of California that send an anthropologist into the field actually should know who they are sending into the field.
Je dirais que les anthropologues, aussi bien Chagnon que Lizot, ne sont pas totalement responsables parce que on les a encensés, on les a divinisés, héroïsés, sanctifiés. Alors c'est on a fait tellement livres, films, les fondations multiples ont donné des millions pour eux.
the impression that people had that all anthropologists are sort of nuts and violent who've gone to the Yanomami is only true up to a certain extent. All the rest of them are nuts and violent, except, of course, me. But it is true that I have never initiated a harsh, critical assessment of the work of any other anthropologist who's worked among the Yanomami. I have ignored an enormous number of criticisms of my work, some of which have been very, very personal, and I've not bothered to respond to these kinds of things.
What in the hell is an anthropologist doing working for the Atomic Energy Commission? I want that explained. We passed resolutions against secret research back in the 60s. How much of that research is open to the public? That whole, not just Chagnon's part, but the whole thing that Neel is doing and everybody else.
Yeah, the fundamental underlying research purpose of the Yanomami project has never been in doubt. It was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission, and it fell into a much more all-embracing scheme to establish guidelines for the effects of levels of exposure to radiation, in the worst case, of course, by atomic explosions of atomic weapons, such as had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what he really felt he needed for scientific purposes was a control group who would be completely isolated, as far as possible anyway, from any effects of atomic radiation or industrial pollution like a modern urban population, to get a kind of a human baseline to serve as a control group for measuring the effects of exposure to things like radiation and other kinds of pollutants. So the Yanomami turned out to be the ideal group because they had never, not only had they never been exposed to atomic radiation, obviously, out in the forest in the Amazon, but they also had not been exposed to any major epidemic diseases.
One of the things that the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was set up to do was to study the unique population that was created by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to study the adverse effects of an atomic bomb, what happens with people over time, what happens with children, what happens with old people, what happens when you have babies to the offspring. So James Neel was brought in to come up with a research plan, a research program that would allow the scientists to monitor the adverse effects and to document and study what the effects of this massive exposure might be.
I was working with another Amazonian group, the Kayapo. Neel asked me, as an anthropologist, whether the Kayapo had had any epidemics, like measles. I had to inform him that they had just had, a few years back, a very serious measles epidemic. So Neel decided not to do a major project with the Kayapo.
About that time, I met James V. Neel, who was then the head of the Human Genetics Department at the University of Michigan Medical School. He joined me in the field in 1966, and we collected blood samples from a rather large number of Yanomami in the Venezuelan Upper Orinoco region, especially around Mavaca, which was the base of my operations.
Cold War was also hot war. It was also about biological and chemical weapons and the development of biological chemical weapons. And our use of indigenous peoples also extended to that as well. So and that part is still largely classified.
If you inject a vaccine of a certain strength, of a certain level, you can observe the level of response of the population, the antibodies that the population produces. And this was already done in among the Marshall Islanders, who were, living in places that the U.S. had conducted atomic weapons tests. He tested the Yanomami blood and established that they were, in fact, what's called a virgin soil population. They didn't have antibodies for measles and other epidemic diseases. And that was what he was looking for. He really wanted to have a control group population and then to be able to challenge the immune systems to measure the level of immune response.
This year's team consists of an ethnologist, 2 geneticists, a dentist, an ethnophotographer, a young missionary to these Indians, a linguist, and a cook. Our objective can most simply be defined as an effort to understand the population structure of primitive man and how that structure is influenced by the environment in which he finds himself. Most of us will enter quietly, but the anthropologist will enter in the customary style of an Indian visitor.
En nuestra expedición del año 68 con el grupo de la Universidad de Michigan y el Instituto Venezolano de Investigaciones Científicas, IVIC, Napoleón jugó el papel más importante de la expedición. Si bien la expedición era dirigida por el doctor James Neel y el doctor Marcel Roche, Napoleón era el responsable de que todas las muestras sanguíneas correspondieran y tuvieran la relación de parentesco y fueran anotados con la relación de parentesco que tenían los grupos en la zona.
Since the transmission of genes, of course, depends on survival well into adulthood, we feel we must understand many aspects of the disease pressures to which these Indians are subject.
Neel had already received word before he left the United States for Venezuela in '68 that there was an outbreak of measles. It was moving, as it were, down the Orinoco from the frontier region of Brazil. It could be expected to probably reach the Yanomami area where he was going to do his research.
Unfortunately, the very month that we arrived, measles had broken out among the Yanomami, first in Brazil and second in Venezuela.
There's an epidemic of measles lower on the Orinoco. The expedition had brought measles vaccine as a preventive measure. But what had been meant to be an exercise in preventive medicine has now turned into a race to save the Yanomami from the disaster of a measles epidemic. The anthropologist has explained the need for vaccination to the headman, and his family goes first.
Neel was interested in studying the reactions of this virgin soil population, the Yanomami, to very strong a vaccine like Edmiston B, the reactions to which were as close as possible to actual cases of the disease.
This was called the Edmiston B Vaccine, and you're supposed to give it with a dose of gamma globulin because it was the most reactive vaccine ever approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States.
The vaccination with gamma globulin gives sometimes a little fever, a little runny eyes, but if he sees somebody with a real rash,
get him out.
Well, get him out where?
Out here.
From where?
From away from the group. He's going to go every day to visit Prodigy's group.
Okay, okay.
He didn't have enough immune globulin, as it turned out. He didn't come with the correct amount, so he was skimping on it. And they vaccinated Edmiston without giving the required amount of gamma globulin, without giving any gamma globulin. And the results were the worst fevers that had ever been recorded to that point in the world for any vaccine experiment.
It's silly to say that in the midst of all the other biological sampling that he did with hair samples, skin samples, every conceivable bodily substance and so on, that the injections alone were not at all intended as part of this research program, but instead just for a humanitarian purpose.
The claims against James V. Neel of putting his research priorities for scientific reasons ahead of humanistic causes is absolutely, totally false. The first thing that we did every time I was with this particular group of medical scientists was to call all the people together and attend first and foremost to the sicknesses that were occurring in that village, no matter what they were.
Hiba hudu te aporun. Te pei medicina para qual piojo. Medicina para qual piojo. Akura jama. Hakure medicina jama kwama.
He got clobbered with gamma globulin is given with the measles vaccine to reduce the reactions. This village was fortunate. It was vaccinated in time.
In a multidisciplinary study, they make a specific claim and they apply it to their expedition as a general rule. This village was fortunate. It was vaccinated in time.
We have inoculated the Patanoa teddy as far as our inoculations went. We'll have to try to isolate them as best we can. Meanwhile, we've gone ahead and vaccinated all of the rest of the Patanoa teddy that we had vaccine for. Now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Neel.
And we know now, and it's been confirmed by the American Anthropological Association's El Dorado Task Force, that in fact lots of people died at Patanoa teddy where they made that film and where they made that false claim.
It is possible that they will be bringing gamma globulin, which will in part take the edge off of measles, but what is also needed is a good supply of antibiotics in order to treat the secondary infections that so often go with measles. Over to you.
What we know now is that Neel was aware that he was exposing the Patanoa teddy to guides who were already infected with measles. Initially, he decided not to take them. He said, in a surge of conscience. It's almost very disturbing why he would consider describing this common decency and legal requirement and medical ethics to be a surge of conscience rather than his constant preoccupation. But he leaves behind the infected guides when he leaves Mavaca on February 18th, and he goes upriver to try to find the Patanoa teddy for the filming and blood taking and genetic CDC studies that he's doing. Unfortunately, they can't find Patanoa teddy. Chagnon can't find it, he doesn't know where it is. So Neel writes in his notes that he decides to send Nap back to get 2 of the exposed Patanoa teddy guides, because he says measles will be at this village anyway. Although there is in fact no reason at all to think that measles could be at this village unless it's brought by the expedition. I think that Chagnon and Senewal argued for him to leave them behind and for them to be kept at Mavaca.
Weedocaya teddies have been exposed to measles already. They've come up here and have exposed them to measles. And I'm afraid that if I bring them into Patanoa teddy with us, they're going to expose the whole group to measles.
Chagnon is heard saying this on the tapes, try to keep them at Mavaca. But the problem is that Neel decides that he needs 2 of the Patanoa teddy guides to find the village. He himself, amazingly enough, had already gotten very sick in Caracas. He said that he had a beastly upper respiratory infection. And Neel himself had documented that these kind of infections could kill lots of people at first contact. So what kind of a guy, what kind of a doctor goes around to very remote villages, uncontacted villages are what he's looking for, with a case of possible influenza? And he's putting his hands down people's throats to take saliva samples.
These organisms. Nasal and throat swabs are placed in silica gel for transportation to a base laboratory in the United States.
So you have on his expedition a unique synergy between different diseases, and they all work together. You have live measles carriers, you have terrible vaccine reactions, you have a chief doctor and head of the expedition with influenza-like symptoms, you have one guide with malaria, and you have Brewer with a bad case of dysentery, which is also proven fatal for remote villages on first contact.
Here Charlie is having modest difficulties documenting an unusual pattern of wear of the central incisors.
So you've got five different violent introductions of outside pathogens. At least there are probably more.
Habaya matitano manamai. Te muyama ai harili akuda mai. Omi te muyama makui. Wamane ke hiwawe. Ai pe tapi bakai toawe. Tapi pun pe tama kai tama kuberai. Ha Husha mi hamene mi tabakai ta talama
Adesso mi fai dire cose che forse poi non gli fa piacere dopo Chagnon quando lo vede, ma lì doveva dire che era per studiare se avevano malattie che servivano per curarli dopo, i risultati, che era un po' vero. So che dopo che siamo usciti, mi pare dopo, sono rimasti anche loro, c'è arrivato un po' dei measles.
Terbuka miam yahuma ya oboma 30 ya oboma nama anya boma.
Kami iba aja ya. Ina bosir aku lalu. Ku yang so ya pergi kena thai ku beli. Kami tahia biele temu kuawe.
Más de 200 penomarayo mija. Este no han haton o wedita no han o shaki habawaro mo hakuikene o mihi awayune o mihi iya per toa noi tedeng mi ina ya puhi markush
shaki ano teno naba mai kai para te bari hirai bana ano hiwani bodori man shaki amayo shi hirai ba mihi le ba marka yare ma mihi mayo ano thai apa shaki atar itu sarabio porque waru suada tapi brea suada dia
a Napoleón lo culparon, ¿no? Porque claro que es por la enfermedad de sarampión se moría, ¿no?
Ya justo bodita sakin iba bahasa mana nyami uno ya kubraro ho ya buyakun sakli atabro teh yani ya surprise serikan yani ya surprise sakiano thai ya puhi imia.
In general, the health of the Yanomami appears good. Infant and childhood mortality are relatively low by tropical standards. If the past is any guide, it will not long stay that way. The health of primitive man usually quickly deteriorates in the course of acculturation. Ours is perhaps the last generation to be able to study truly primitive man.
I tried to avoid writing about Napoleon Chagnon as long as possible. I was writing a book for Viking Penguin. I had a large advance. It was about the gold rush. And so my editor and Viking Penguin and myself, we didn't want to deal with Napoleon Chagnon because we knew that he was kind of like a black hole who sucked all light into himself, and you inevitably were caught up in these conflicts that he was involved in for decades.
Because I had been involved with the Yanomami, I was one of the people who got sent a draft galley proofs to do a review of them for the publishers. And I and another colleague, Leslie Sponsel from the University of Hawaii, he also was sent this. So we wrote a memo to the leadership of the American Anthropological Association, what we thought was a confidential communication saying, watch out, this thing is going to really make a huge stir when it's published, and you should be getting ready. And of course, the first thing that happened is one of these people to whom we sent this confidential letter put it on the web, and it was around the world in 24 hours.
I actually first heard about the letter circulating from a Malaysian student who at the time, if I recall, was in Japan on a grant as a visiting researcher, and she had picked it up on a Malaysian Aborigine Orang Asli listserv where people were discussing, and so that's then a colleague from Finland alerted me too, and then I realized this is just all over the world.
If you read the email, they accuse me and James V. Neel, for example, of engaging in a hideous experiment using the Yanomami as guinea pigs comparing us both to not Joseph Conrad in The Heart of Darkness, but to the Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele. So I was not only, from the very outset in 2000, accused of homicide, but I was also accused of genocide. A year later, Tierney's book was published, and immediately a new level of discomfort, anxiety, anger, resentment, etc. began in my life, and it's still going on.
The book received quite a bit of sensationalistic play, pushed initially by people like Turner and Spossel, longtime enemies of Chagnon. And so all of a sudden, anthropology had this embarrassing kind of situation. The text that more anthropology professors used for their introductory cultural and social structure courses somehow was called into question as a product of an evil ethnographer.
It was extraordinarily painful for him to have, to become known as a genocidal maniac with, eugenics beliefs to the world at large.
Well, this will never go away, Every accusation Tierney made could be disproved, and it'll still never go away. There are people who simply won't go near Yanomami or his work anymore, even if they don't know if it's right or wrong.
There are some anthropologists who seriously consider anthropology to now be more like a religion than a science. And it's a religion in the sense that the truths that anthropologists subscribe to now are established more by faith than by evidence. And one of the truths is that biology has nothing to do with cultural behavior. And I challenge that truth. And so, like the church, or like Islam, popes and ayatollahs step forth defending the faith and identifying who the heretics are and burning them. If I went to Venezuela, the next day, prominent newspapers in Venezuela would carry big headline articles that listed all of the crimes against the Yanomami Chagnon had committed and therefore should not be allowed to go into the Yanomami area. It was as if these people were tracking every move I made. I decided that if I can't be an anthropologist and do field research, I don't want to be a teacher if that's all that an academic career will amount to at that point. So I retired early, hoping to expend my retirement years fishing, hunting birds over my dog Cody, golfing, and just enjoying life.
I have to give him a rest. He's getting old. So am I.
People like Terence Turner, Leslie Sponsel, some of the others, Tierney himself, don't care if they hurt somebody. I mean, I can see that. That's the way they are. They don't care.
He's the latter part, if not the last part, of his career. And this whole reaction to Chagnon's work and what Tierney wrote has been dramatic. It's no minor thing. It's one of the reasons they did this fest for Chagnon and all this is because of what a beating he has taken, a brutal beating.
This is one of my former students, Mark Flynn. He will be involved in the festivities going on in my honor. In fact, he's the organizer.
Hey, this is the man. This is the man. He's the one who paved the way for everybody. This is the brave man.
How are they to know that Chagnon's data has got problems? How could they know? Where are they going to get the information to know that his data has problems? go down into the villages and restart. No, well, it's years later, different people, different villages, different times. There's nobody can except those who have studied, so many people have studied and say, well, why is it that Chagnon is the only one that comes up with this image of the Yanomami? Why is it just him? She's got some kind of a skill or a sense of going to where the real things are happening, and we're all out here, we're not seeing it. No.
We like everybody, as distinct from anthropologists who hate everybody.
Well, I think, no. We like everybody who's interested in asking questions, gathering data, and trying to use logical ways to assess the data.
Well, that's a good way of expressing what we do. But I think anthropologists will stop agreeing with your definition at the point where you start collecting data.
My feeling is there is an idea among people in the biological wing of all of this that they're scientists because they're emphasizing biology. Therefore, they're scientists. And sometimes because they have statistics. Therefore, they're scientists. But if you're going to do science, you can't just talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. And that means you've got to be very careful with your data.
When people want to believe something badly enough, the standards for evidence get flimsier and flimsier. So they'll accept the idea as supported by evidence when the evidence gets not only weak, but is gone. There's just an illusion of evidence. And it may even fly in the face of evidence, they'll still believe it. Now, the kinds of things that people want to believe are usually self-flattering. What else? They often flatter the group that they belong to. So anybody who identifies himself, let's say, in anthropology as a sociobiologist or a behavioral ecologist, wants to believe this paradigm is good. So somebody else that's working with it and they're going to be quicker to accept the work.
The more I read his body of work, the more amazed I became, because we appreciate him for his, evolutionary, materialist, and quantitative, hard science things. But in the, but what really pisses off anthropologists is in all their different ways they have their pretensions. Knapp outdid them, so that he's a better. Not only in terms of his data being much more careful, also he's just a more subtle and engaged participant observer.
And this is where I think Chagnon's been very wise, if not slick, in jumping on the sociobiology and an evolutionary psychology bandwagon. He got onto this. He knew what would fit their model. He knew what kind of data were necessary, and he got it.
And so I just want to sort of say final score. Nap won. 5-0.
I don't think that there's any way they can salvage Chagnon in the long run. I think that the contradictions in his data and the evidence of his human rights violations are so great that all that they managed to do is to bring themselves into Chagnon's sinking ship,
That brought biology to anthropology, and he brought anthropology to biology, but it was bought at the price of the wrath of the political ideologists.
Is this what has come of us? Can't we do better than that? People talking and talking and citing and citing and publishing and publishing. We need to be asking, are we answering questions? Or are we just peacocks parading about in all of our show? There's a song from the long ago. You say apricot, I say apricot. All these different things. But you say this, I say that. Does each person have their own word and that's it? I say you are a genocidal murderer and you say I'm cute and that's it? No, if you've done murder, I'm sorry, there's more to it.
I like bananas and you
like bananas. I say Havana and I get Havana. Bananas, bananas, Havana, Havana. Go your way, I'll go mine. But whoa, whoa, if we call the whole thing off, then we must fall. And whoa, whoa, if you ever part, then that might break my heart.
So if you like pajamas and I like pajamas, I'll wear pajamas and give up pajamas. For we know we need each other, so let's call the whole thing off.
That is the irony. Guys like Chagnon and his ilk claim that I married a Yanomami woman to jumpstart my anthropological career. They have absolutely no idea how much, with no regrets, it inhibited my anthropological work. Having a Yanomami woman in the U.S. with 3 kids who can only count to 2 and trying to have a full-time teaching job. I had no time to write and publish. I don't regret. I'm very happy. I'll take 3 kids over 3 books any day, especially my kids.
Les Indiens Yanomami vivent en pleine Amazonie, aux confins du Venezuela et du Brésil. Grâce à un homme, Jacques Lizot, qui les a rencontrés il y a 20 ans, on les connaît mieux.
J'ai voulu simplement essayer d'exposer à un public comme les Français, par exemple, une autre manière de vivre, une autre manière d'être, à travers la langue, à travers la vie quotidienne et la vie sociale.
L'anthropologue les a non seulement étudiés, mais il vit avec eux. C'est pourtant l'un des plus grands savants de notre époque.
When I visited Florence, I walked right underneath the window that was the room that Galileo was imprisoned in. And I looked up and I said, there are some people in the Catholic Church today that want to do that to me too. Ironically, Galileo was only exonerated by the Catholic Church 400 years after he died. I can't wait that long.
Next tonight, a tribal tale of betrayal and ambition, a little closer to home. It's Macbeth.